All right, yeah! Thank God for fantasy football. I'm Buster Brown, and the show is called Redemption Rehab. Today, we're taking a look at the Week 9 waiver wire report, guys you must have and pick up on your waiver wire. Starting with this guy. How about Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns? He's only owned in 20% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had 7 catches for 99 yards with 2 touchdowns on 9 targets. Hey, if you hit that subscribe button now, you'd known about this guy. We talked about him last week. We said he was going to have a big game, and he did. Another guy we really liked that we talked about last week that you could have found out about if you'd hit that subscribe button was Keon Coleman of the Buffalo Bills. Last week, he had 5 catches for 70 yards and a touchdown on 7 targets. He's only owned in 55% of fantasy football leagues, so there's a chance he might be on your waiver wire. This is a guy you can't guard one-on-one when you got guys on the same team like a James Cook, like a Shakir, like an Amari Cooper, like a Dalton Kincaid. You got to guard this guy, double team him, and they can't. That's why he's going to have a big year. Keon Coleman, 6'4", 220 pounds. We talked about him on our NFL draft preview shows we do in April, and we highlighted people that are going to impact fantasy football. He was one of the rookies we talked about. Another rookie we talked about on that show, how about Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers? He's only owned in 40% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had 4 catches for 38 yards on 4 targets. And with the injuries they have out there in San Francisco, which they're on bye this week, this kid could get some playing time. Another guy we talked about last week is Elijah Moore of the Cleveland Browns. He plays out of the slot. He's only owned in 5% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had 8 catches for 85 yards on 12 targets. And this week, he plays a tougher defense in the Los Angeles Chargers, but he's somebody we would consider picking up, putting on our bench. Who else do we like at wide receiver to keep on our radar? How about some of these guys? We like Jalen McMillan of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We talked about him last week. He's owned in 50% of fantasy football leagues. They tried to get him the ball. He had 4 catches last week for 35 yards on 7 targets. Other guys we like on Tampa Bay are Trey Palmer and Sterling Shepard. Another guy we liked and we've talked about in the past, how about Demarcus Robinson of the Los Angeles Rams? He's only owned in 20% of fantasy football leagues. Last week he only had 2 catches for 35 yards, but they were both touchdowns. He's going to have trouble competing with Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp coming back, but he looks like he's the 3rd option for Matthew Stafford. We also like a guy we've been talking about all year is Michael Wilson of the Arizona Cardinals. He's only owned in 5% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had 5 catches for 31 yards on 6 targets. And a new guy we haven't talked about all year that we think has a chance to break out is Parker Washington of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's not owned in any fantasy football leagues. He had 3 catches for 46 yards on 4 targets. With the injuries to Christian Kirk and Brian Thomas, this guy's going to get a chance to play. So go out and get yourself some Parker Washington. I wouldn't be surprised if he's a big waiver wire pickup next week. But you can get him this week. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. Who else do we like? Well, how about some of these guys? Look, we've been talking about running backs all year and how important they are when you go into a draft. You got to know where you're getting your running backs and your tight ends. If you want a good running back that might be on your waiver wire that's only owned in maybe 40% of fantasy football leagues, how about Tyrone Tracy of the New York Giants? Last week on Monday night, he had 20 carries for 145 yards and 1 TD. He left the game with a shoulder injury, came back, then left the game with a concussion. There's a good chance he's not playing this week. Devin Singletary's the guy you want, and Eric Gray would be his handcuff. Keep an eye on that situation. And if you want some sleeper picks at running back, we've been talking about these guys all year. Dalvin Cook of the Dallas Cowboys, Clyde Edwards-Helaire of the Kansas City Chiefs, and I'll tell you what, Dameon Pierce of the Texans are all widely available in most fantasy football leagues. They're an injury of playing significant time heading into the playoffs. Hey, you need a tight end? We've got some guys we really like. We've been talking about Cade Otton for weeks on Fantasy Football Redemption Rehab. If you'd have been a subscriber, you'd have known about him all year. Last week, he had 9 catches for 81 yards and 2 TDs on 10 targets. Go out, get him, trade for him, whatever you got to do, because this guy's going to be catching balls like this all year with the injuries that they have down there in Tampa. We've been telling you all year about Hunter Henry. He's only owned in 45% of fantasy football leagues, so he might still be out there. He had 5 catches for 45 yards on 6 targets for the New England Patriots. And we've been telling you about Taysom Hill for the New Orleans Saints. He's still only owned in 25% of fantasy football leagues. He was 1 for 1 passing for 3 yards. He also ran the ball 4 times for 20 yards, and he caught 2 passes for 21 yards as a tight end. You got to go out and get this guy because he's going to have a decent year if he stays healthy the rest of the year. And I'll tell you what, with the injury to T. Higgins, how about Mike Gesicki of the Cincinnati Bengals? He's only owned in 10% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had 7 catches for 73 yards on 8 targets. Hey, we got some quarterbacks we talked about. How about this guy we told you about last week you should pick up and put on your bench? Jameis Winston. He's only owned in 5% of fantasy football leagues for the Cleveland Browns. Last week, he was 27 of 41 for 334 yards and 3 touchdowns and a quarterback rating of 115. Now, of course, Baltimore Ravens secondary was banged up, but this guy showed up, and he's going to ball out again against the Los Angeles Chargers again this week at home. So you might want to consider putting him on your bench. And another quarterback that balled out was Matthew Stafford. We talked about him last week. He went out there, and he had a big game, completing 25 of 34 passes for 279 yards and 4 touchdowns, with a quarterback rating of a whopping 124. And he's only owned in 40% of fantasy football leagues, so he might be available. How about some of these defenses? You need a good defense? How about you go out and get yourself some Cincinnati Bengals against the Las Vegas Raiders? They're only owned in 30% of fantasy football leagues. We also like the New England Patriots at Tennessee. New England's only owned in 5% of fantasy football leagues. We like the New Orleans Saints at Carolina. New Orleans is only owned in 30% of fantasy football leagues. And the Washington Commanders against the New York Giants. They're only owned in 20% of fantasy football leagues. I'll tell you what, if you need yourself a good kicker, we told you last week, we're going to tell you this week, as the weather gets bad, go out and get yourself some dome kickers. We like Jake Bates of the Detroit Lions. If you listened to us last week, hit that subscribe button. He got you 13 points. And we also like Will Reichard of the Minnesota Vikings. He's only owned in 20% of fantasy football leagues. And I'll tell you what, you got to get dome kickers at this time of year because when the weather gets bad, these guys don't have to deal with it if they're kicking in a dome stadium. Tell you what, that's it for the Week 9 Waiver Wire Report. I'm Buster Brown. The show is called Redemption Rehab. Good luck.